You think the Aztec Empire was all about gold, pyramids, and human sacrifice? Think again. Because beneath the stone temples and feathered headdresses was a world of sexual rituals so disturbing they'd make the most depraved corners of the internet look tame. We're talking about ceremonies where pleasure and pain were inseparable, where the body wasn't just a vessel, it was an offering, a society where virginity could be currency, where forced couplings were public spectacle, and where ecstasy and death were sometimes the same event. Forget the sanitized museum displays, you're about to hear what the textbooks were too afraid to print. In the Aztec Empire, virginity wasn't a personal choice or a moral badge, it was a political weapon. Girls were inspected by elders like livestock, their bodies examined for purity before they were handed over for ritual use. The most prized virgins were taken not to be wives, but to be sacrificed after elaborate ceremonies that mocked the very idea of intimacy. They'd be bathed in scented water, painted with sacred pigments, and dressed in gowns so heavy they could barely walk. The entire city might gather to watch as these girls were paired, often against their will, with male captives. But here's the twist. This wasn't about reproduction. It was about humiliation, control, and appeasing gods with the most untouched flesh. Any sign of resistance? The punishment was public and brutal, whipping, mutilation, or worse. Even more disturbing, these ceremonies blurred the lines between sex and sacrifice. Some virgins were forced to dance through the night with their partners, forbidden to stop, their exhaustion part of the spectacle. By morning, they'd be led, still painted, and dressed up the temple steps for their hearts to be cut out. Imagine the crowd's roar, not for the beauty of youth, but for the slow breaking of it. In the Aztec worldview, virginity was never innocence. It was ammunition in the hands of priests and rulers, a resource to be spent in blood and spectacle. And for those chosen, there was no way out. Among the Aztec pantheon, one deity stood out for his appetite, not for blood alone, but for what came before it. Xochipilli, the so-called Prince of Flowers, was worshipped as the god of art, beauty, and sexual pleasure. His festivals were anything but gentle. Imagine the entire city transformed into a carnival of sanctioned chaos, drums pounding like a heartbeat, incense smoke curling through the streets, dancers painted in dazzling colors that hid nothing. And in the heart of it all, rituals where chosen men and women were expected to unite publicly as offerings to the god. Not in the shadows, not in secrecy, but in the open courtyards, in front of family, neighbors, and strangers, because in Aztec belief, privacy was weakness. It wasn't a night of pleasure, it was a command performance. The chosen participants weren't always willing. Captives taken in war could be dressed as the god or goddess's avatar, adorned in embroidered fabrics and gold jewelry, then paraded to the ritual grounds. Their bodies were painted in bright red dyes, the color of both flowers and blood, a reminder that this ceremony had two endings, one physical, one fatal. Priests watched closely to ensure the act happened exactly as prescribed, timed to the rhythm of the drumming, witnessed by the high-ranking elite. Any deviation was punished immediately, sometimes with the blunt edge of a ceremonial knife right there on the platform. And here's the twist, it wasn't just about honoring Xochipilli. These acts doubled as a form of public shaming, a way for rulers to strip captives and even disobedient citizens of dignity before the final kill. It blurred the lines between worship and weaponized humiliation. Those who performed were praised for serving the god, but everyone knew the truth. It was the slow destruction of a person's identity in front of thousands. If you think this was just about the past, think again. Imagine your most private act turned into a public spectacle, your every movement judged, your face remembered forever, not for love, but for submission. This wasn't a one-night ordeal, either. Some festivals stretched on for days, with rounds of pairings, dances, and chants echoing into the night, while priests moved silently among the crowd, marking the next to ascend the temple steps. The scent of copal incense mixed with sweat, blood, and the metallic tang of anticipation. By dawn, the plaza would be washed down, the bodies cleared away, and the drums silenced until the next god demanded his due. In the Aztec worldview, the line between intimacy and execution wasn't just thin, it didn't exist. The most coveted sacrifices were not plucked at random, but chosen in pairs. A man and a woman, bound together in body before they were bound in death. It was called tlakasipahualistli, the flaying of men. But the name only hints at the nightmare. The chosen lovers might meet only a day before their final walk. Often, one was a captive warrior, the other a young woman taken from a conquered city. They'd be dressed in costumes representing divine couples, gold, turquoise, jaguar pelts, transforming them from human beings into living symbols. But this transformation came at a price. Their first trial was the night of union, a ritual coupling performed under the eyes of priests who circled them like vultures. The couple would be forced to lie together in a chamber heavy with incense smoke, lit only by the flicker of oil lamps. Drums beat slowly outside, a reminder that time was running out. This wasn't a celebration, it was the beginning of the end. The priests weren't there to bless them, but to make sure the act was completed, because in the Aztec mind, the mingling of life's creation and life's destruction fed the gods more powerfully than either alone. By dawn, the couple would emerge into blinding sunlight, the plaza below already crowded. Children sat on rooftops to get a better view. Merchants closed their stalls. Even warriors leaned on their spears, silent. The couple, still adorned, would climb the steep temple steps together. Every step was agony, the costumes were heavy, the air thin, the knowledge of what was waiting suffocating. The woman might be led first, her partner just behind, each step stained with the blood of those who went before. At the summit, there was no final kiss, no whispered goodbye. The priests would separate them instantly, one held down on the stone slab, the other forced to watch. A blade of obsidian, so sharp it could split a hair, would pierce the chest and carve through bone. The heart, still beating, was raised to the sun, blood cascading down the steps. The surviving partner didn't survive long, they'd be placed on the slab next. The same ritual repeated. Their bodies were rolled down the temple stairs, their ornate costumes now soaked and shredded. And here's the part most history books leave out: the flaying. Skilled priests would remove the skin from the man's body and wear it like a cloak during the remainder of the festival, parading through the streets as if the victim's spirit still walked among them. In some cases, the skin was worn warm, the blood still damp against the priest's own flesh. The woman's hair and ornaments were sometimes taken as talismans, worn by other women in the community to absorb her beauty or fertility. This wasn't seen as cruelty, it was cosmic necessity. To the Aztecs, these acts kept the sun rising and the rains falling. But for the people chosen, it was the ultimate degradation. Their love forced, their deaths public, their bodies dismantled and consumed by the living. Modern parallels? Imagine being forced into marriage, the entire event live-streamed to millions, knowing it ends with your execution, your partner's face being the last human thing you see. This wasn't a spectacle you could avoid. Attendance was mandatory. Children learned from it. Adults justified it. Rulers thrived on it. The message was carved into the city's memory. Love is not yours, it belongs to the gods. And the gods are never gentle. And in the Aztec Empire, there was always another festival, another god, another couple climbing those steps. If the smaller rituals were intimate horrors, the great Aztec festivals were nightmares on a civic scale. Entire cities turned into arenas where every man, woman, and child was a spectator, a participant, or a victim. The most infamous of these was the festival of Toxcatl, held in honor of Tezcatlipoca, the god of fate, sorcery, and war. In the public imagination, Tezcatlipoca was seductive and terrifying, a deity who could bless you with beauty and destroy you with disease in the same breath. And like his nature, the rituals dedicated to him were a blend of ecstasy and annihilation. Preparations began months in advance. A young man perfect in body, strong in face, and without a single physical blemish, was chosen to play the god's living avatar for a full year. He was dressed daily in immaculate robes, given fine food, music, and women. He became a walking embodiment of divine pleasure, moving through the city surrounded by admirers and guards. But everyone knew his fate. His final month was a slow tightening of the noose, more banquets, more gifts, more women sent to his chambers, as if the priests were trying to pour all possible pleasures into him before they ripped him apart. And it wasn't just him. For Toxcatl, other chosen men and women were selected to accompany the Avatar, serving him in every capacity, feeding him, bathing him, and, in the final nights, joining him in ceremonies that were less about devotion and more about the public display of submission. These encounters didn't happen in secrecy. Temporary stages were built in the plazas, decorated with flowers, feathers, and banners bearing the god's image. Crowds gathered in the thousands, the air thickened with the scent of copal incense and human sweat. The sound of drums, deep, slow, and resonant, carried through the city, keeping time for the acts unfolding before the masses. This was the first layer of control, erasing the idea of private intimacy. By watching, the crowd was complicit. By participating, the chosen lost all claim to their own bodies. And as the festival reached its peak, the spectacle grew darker. The final day began before dawn. The avatar of Tezcatlipoca was dressed in his finest garments, every inch of him a vision of godly beauty. He walked slowly through the city, flanked by his attendants, each carrying flowers that would be scattered in his path. Music played. People wept openly, not because they loved him, but because the beauty was about to be destroyed. At the base of the Great Pyramid, the women who had shared his final nights were paraded separately, their elaborate hairstyles undone, their painted faces streaked with sweat. This, too, was intentional, a visual stripping of the god's pleasures, showing that even beauty was temporary. One by one, they were led up the temple steps alongside him. The crowd roared as the avatar ascended, not resisting, but walking with measured dignity. He knew his role, and in the Aztec view, fulfilling it perfectly was the highest honor a mortal could achieve. At the summit, the ceremony turned from reverent to brutal in seconds. The women were positioned to watch as the avatar was laid on the sacrificial stone. The high priest's blade flashed in the sun, obsidian so sharp it could sever arteries in a single stroke. The heart was pulled free, still beating, and held aloft for all to see. Blood poured down the grooves in the altar, splattering the stone steps below. The women, sobbing or silent, followed next, their bodies treated with the same swift precision. The priests worked quickly, the crowd demanded it, and yet, this was only the middle of the festival. The hearts were offered to the sun, the bodies tumbled down the steps, and the skins of some victims were removed and worn by dancers who moved through the streets, the scent of fresh blood following them like a shadow. Feasts began almost immediately. Meat roasted over open flames, drums pounded faster, and the city turned into a whirlwind of intoxication, music, and chaotic coupling. Some of these pairings were voluntary, many were not. In the chaos, the boundaries between ritual and opportunistic cruelty blurred completely. The priests claimed it was all for Tezcatlipoca, but the reality was simpler. It was the empire's way of reminding everyone, nobles, merchants, farmers, and captives, that no one's body was their own when the gods demanded otherwise. By nightfall, the streets were slick with spilled drink, crushed flowers, and streaks of blood. The survivors staggered home or slept in the open. The temple steps gleamed dark in the moonlight, and in the plaza below, the priests stood in small groups, quietly marking names for the next year's festival. It wasn't over, it was never over. The wheel kept turning, the gods kept hungering, and the people kept giving, because the alternative refusal was unthinkable. War in the Aztec Empire didn't end with the last clash of obsidian blades. It ended when the defeated learned that their bodies now belonged to someone else. Captives were marched into Tenochtitlan not as prisoners but as raw material for ritual, stripped of rank, clothing, and even their names. The first indignity was public display. They were tethered in lines through the marketplace, while vendors paused their haggling to stare. Children pointed from rooftops, and drummers kept a slow, taunting beat. Women captured from enemy towns were separated and led beneath banners, their hair cropped or rearranged by priestly attendants as a sign that whatever intimacy they'd known before had been annulled. The message was loud without a word. Conquest didn't just take your land, it repossessed your body, repurposed your gestures, and rewrote your most private customs in the conqueror's script. The rituals that followed fused sexuality to punishment so deliberately that even bystanders felt complicit. Captive men were paraded beside elite maidens chosen by the priesthood not to elevate the captives, but to degrade them. The pairings were arranged to telegraph power. A defeated warrior forced to stand beside a noblewoman who would never touch him. A village girl placed beside a priest whose only caress would be the binding cords. Priests narrated the proceedings like a theater of humiliation, speaking in metaphors that everyone understood: flowers plucked, fields tilled, seeds scattered, turning living people into agricultural parables. These metaphors weren't poetry. They were orders. Bodies were positioned, poses enforced, gestures calibrated to the drum. The purpose wasn't arousal. It was administration. The act was a ledger entry, a bureaucratic movement of the conquered from human to offering. The flower wars had already primed the populace to see captives as currency, and the ceremonies sealed the exchange. In some rites, captives were given ceremonial garments meant to mock marital finery: paper crowns, feathered capes, anklets that jingled when they walked, so the crowd could hear their submission as much as see it. The women's garments were heavier, pinned and laced until breathing felt like a confession. Priests would fix a blossom at the breastbone, a fragile emblem placed precisely where a blade would soon enter, and explain to the crowd that this flower waited for the sun. Any hesitation was punished instantly. Whips cracked, reed canes struck shoulders and calves, and the lesson was underlined: even your flinch belongs to us. Pairings moved in, choreographed circuits around the plaza: kneel, stand, turn, bow, so that thousands could witness the same sequence, imprinting the city with a memory of subjugation. The humiliation served a double appetite: the gods, who demanded order in blood, and the empires, which demanded proof that its victories could reorganize the most intimate rhythms of life. Then came the pivot, the moment when the ritual crossed from staged obedience to permanent erasure. Captive men might be led to the gladiatorial stone, adorned like grooms but tethered like livestock, handed a blunt weapon to face a ring of elite warriors. The crowd watched the doomed performance, knowing its ending. Nearby, captive women were compelled into processions that simulated bridal marches, paced to the same drums as the impending sacrifice. They were presented before idols whose carved mouths were painted with cinnabar, the color of both blessing and wound. Priests invoked union while preparing separation. The body would be joined to the god by being opened, the marriage completed when the heart met the sun. In the final minutes, the choreography tightened. Captive pairs were forced to face one another across the staircase, each ordered to witness the other's fate. A man's defeat below the stone was the preface to the woman's ascent. Her step toward the summit was the period at the end of his sentence. Nothing here was private. Grief was part of the program. The crowd learned where to look, when to gasp, when to go silent. Even the washing of the plaza afterward, water thrown from clay jars, crimson sluicing toward the drains, was ritualized, as if cleanliness itself had to be commanded back into the city after so much deliberate contamination. Modern parallels make the stomach turn. Think of a justice system that televises punishment to teach obedience, or an algorithm that turns shame into spectacle and spectacle into policy. That was the Aztec calculus: make the conquered perform their loss. Then fix that performance in the public mind until resistance feels not only risky, but pointless. By the time the hearts were raised and the bodies rolled, the lesson had already landed. The empire didn't just win wars in the field. It won them in the flesh, converting desire into decree and intimacy into infrastructure. When the drums finally stopped, merchants reopened their stalls, children chased each other through the damp footprints, and the banners hung motionless, proof that order had been restored by choreographing disorder. And still, beneath the quiet, the city remembered the beat, because the beat always returned. Next comes the escalation you're not ready for. When the empire turned these punishments inward on its own people, so that even obedience could become a crime if the gods woke hungry. You could survive a war, Live your life in the markets and gardens of Tenochtitlan. Serve your city faithfully, and still wake up one day to find your name whispered in a priest's chamber as the next to be honored. The Aztec Empire's cruelty was most terrifying when it turned inward, when the rituals of humiliation and sexualized sacrifice weren't reserved for captives at all, but for its own citizens. Loyalty didn't make you safe. In fact, being noticed could be the most dangerous thing of all. One path to destruction was through the temple schools, the Kalmikak and Telpushkali, where boys and girls were raised under the eye of priests. Publicly, they were educated in poetry, warfare, and religion. Privately, they were assessed for physical perfection, beauty, and symbolic value. A young man who excelled at song or dance might be chosen to embody a god during a festival, which sounded like a great honor until you understood the ending. A young woman of exceptional grace or voice might be singled out to serve as the consort of that living god, her role celebrated in song, her image woven into banners, and her fate sealed. Once chosen, there was no refusal. These citizens were prepared through months of controlled living. Special diets, ritual baths scented with marigold and copal, and constant rehearsals of the gestures and postures they would perform. Sexuality in these moments wasn't spontaneous, it was scripted, measured to the beat of drums, watched by teachers who corrected every move. For men, the task was to project divine strength and pleasure. For women, divine fertility and surrender. Any lapse was punished, sometimes by public shaming in the plaza, where the entire neighborhood could watch you be corrected for the god you would soon meet. The festivals themselves erased the line between celebration and execution. Citizens knew these were their neighbors up there, people they'd seen buying maize or walking with their families, yet once they donned the god's attire, they were no longer human in the crowd's eyes. The pairing was deliberate. The man paraded with his female consort, both garlanded in flowers, their hands clasped not in affection but in the rigid grip taught to them. The crowd followed them through the streets, singing, throwing petals, some weeping from the beauty, others from knowing what beauty meant in this city. That night, the couple's final performance began. In a guarded chamber, with the high priests seated like judges, they enacted the union that would bind them to the god forever. No one pretended this was private. The point was for the entire court to witness it, to see the god's pleasure embodied before the god's hunger was satisfied. Incense burned so heavily the air shimmered. Drums thudded like a second heartbeat. The attendants adjusted every movement so it matched the divine script. And all the while, outside, the city waited for morning. When dawn came, they emerged transformed in the eyes of the crowd. No longer neighbors, no longer citizens, but avatars carrying the weight of the world's renewal. They climbed the pyramid together. Every step was narrated by priests in booming voices, retelling their months of preparation as if these were heroic deeds rather than a march toward death. At the summit, they were separated instantly. The man, embodying the god, was sacrificed first, his heart lifted high to the rising sun. The woman watched, her face painted with tears or resolve, before she was taken to follow him. Her heart joined his on the altar, two offerings bound by the intimacy the city had demanded from them. And here's the part the empire never admitted but everyone knew. Sometimes, these honored citizens were chosen not for perfection, but for politics. A noble who had offended the wrong priest, a merchant whose wealth made him inconvenient, even a warrior whose popularity threatened the ruler, any could be dressed in divine robes and paraded toward their honor. The beauty of the ritual masked its cruelty. The applause drowned out any protest. Modern parallels are chilling. Imagine a system where your own government can turn your reputation into a death sentence, disguising punishment as prestige, where your neighbors cheer as you're stripped of your life because the spectacle is too beautiful to question. That was the Aztec genius and its terror. They could make even your family believe your destruction was a blessing. When the drums stopped and the plaza was washed clean, life returned to normal, or so it seemed. The market reopened, children played, lovers met in shadowed corners. But in the quiet, everyone knew that another name had already been chosen. Another festival was already being planned. In the Empire's calendar, joy and fear were never more than a few days apart, and in the minds of the people, the two became impossible to separate. It's easy to imagine the relief of surviving another festival, but in Tenochtitlan, survival wasn't safety. It was an audition for the next time the gods turned their gaze inward. And when they did, no loyalty, no devotion, no service could protect you from the moment the drums began again. The most frightening Aztec rituals weren't always the bloodiest. They were the ones designed to hollow a person out from the inside, so that by the time the knife fell, the body was just the last thing left to take. These ceremonies blurred the edges between religious devotion, sexual domination, and psychological warfare, twisting identity until the victim began to question whether they had ever belonged to themselves at all. One of the most insidious methods was the use of Ixiptla, living embodiments of gods. Everyone in the Empire knew the term, but few understood the nightmare it represented until they saw it up close. An Ixiptla was more than a costume or role, it was an erasure. The chosen man or woman was told they no longer had a personal name, no family, no past. From the moment of selection, they were the god. Every movement, every breath, every glance, judged as an expression of divine will. It began with clothing, heavy garments embroidered with sacred symbols, elaborate headdresses, and ornaments that shimmered in the sun. But the true transformation came through isolation and repetition. The Ixiptla would be kept under constant supervision, fed on a strict diet, and forced to rehearse ritual actions for hours each day, walking in slow arcs, turning their head at precise angles, placing their hands in predetermined shapes. Sexual acts, too, were rehearsed like dance, stripped of spontaneity, broken into fragments to be perfected in front of priestly eyes. This was intimacy recast as liturgy. Every touch a prescribed movement in service to the god. The rehearsals weren't just for performance, they were meant to erode the sense of self. The victim became an actor trapped in a role they could never leave. As the months passed, the Ixiptla began to receive visitors, warriors, nobles, and selected women or men sent to commune with the god. Each encounter was another layer of the performance, another reminder that their body was no longer private space, but a temple others could enter at will. In public, they were paraded through the city, their posture flawless, their expression serene, even as the knowledge of their fate gnawed at the edges of their mind. The people watching didn't see a prisoner, they saw a god, radiant and untouchable. This was the cruelest part. The applause wasn't for the human enduring this, it was for the role that had consumed them. In the final month, the restrictions loosened, not out of mercy, but to heighten the psychological break. The Ixiptla was given almost anything they desired. Fine foods, intoxicating drinks, music, companionship. Sexual partners were sent to them in greater numbers, each instructed to treat them with reverence, to whisper praises in the dark. The aim was to make the victim believe, if only for a moment, that they truly were divine. And then, just as they began to surrender to that illusion, the preparations for the final sacrifice began. The descent from worship to death was swift and deliberate. One morning, the Ixiptla would be dressed more magnificently than ever before, robes heavy with gold thread, necklaces so weighty they bowed the neck, headdress feathers swaying like flames in the wind. The city gathered to watch as they processed toward the great temple, attendants at their sides, music trailing behind them. Every step was familiar, rehearsed, but this time, it was the last performance. At the foot of the pyramid, the sexual partners who had been sent to them in the final month were gathered. The Ixiptla was made to look at each one, to acknowledge them, to silently thank them for their service. The crowd watched, sensing the shift from the intimacy of the past nights to the violence about to come. And then the climb began. The steps were steep, worn smooth by centuries of blood and feet. Each level brought them closer to the top, where the altar waited. Here came the final cruelty. At the summit, before the sacrifice, the Ixiptla was stripped of the divine garments. Piece by piece, the symbols of the god were removed until they stood in nothing but the simplest cloth, the illusion of divinity falling away in the eyes of all. They were no longer the god, just a body about to be opened. This was when many broke, Some wept, some begged, some stood silent with a hollowed gaze. The priests didn't care. The body was positioned, the obsidian blade was raised, and the heart was cut free in one smooth motion. But the ritual didn't end there. The heart was placed on a dish of polished stone and shown to the crowd before being offered to the sun. The body, still warm, was dressed again in the divine garments, not for the victim's sake, but for the priest who would now wear them. In this way, the god was never truly gone, only passed to another vessel, ready to begin the cycle again. Modern minds recoil at the brutality of this, but the psychological dimension is what truly chills. A system that could so thoroughly rewrite a person's identity that they might die believing they were a willing participant. It was power at its purest, because it conquered not just the body, but the self. And in the Aztec Empire, there was always another Ixiptla waiting in the wings, already being rehearsed, already learning the steps that would take them to the top of the pyramid. The drums never stopped, they only slowed, ready to quicken again when the next god needed a body to wear. Some festivals ended in daylight, but the most haunting ones unfolded under darkness, when the fires burned low and shadows moved like living things against the temple walls. This was when the city seemed to hold its breath not for fear, but for anticipation. The rituals of night were more intimate, more brutal, and far harder to forget. The plaza glowed with the orange light of hundreds of torches, their smoke mingling with the sweet, cloying scent of copal. Drums beat slowly, each thud echoing through the stones until you could feel it in your chest. On this night, there were no processions. The victims, men, women, sometimes couples, were already waiting at the top of the pyramid, bound in positions that displayed them like offerings in a market stall. The crowd below couldn't see every detail, but they could hear the voices. The chants of the priests rose and fell like waves, interrupted by sharp cries from the bound figures. Some were ceremonial, rehearsed as part of the rite, others were not. The air was thick with heat, and the metallic tang of blood carried down the steps before the first blade even fell. The sacrifices began slowly, deliberately. Each victim was addressed by name, then by the title of the god they were about to join. Sexual humiliation was folded into the prayers. Priests spoke openly of the acts performed in preparation, weaving them into the liturgy so that the crowd would remember the victim not as a neighbor or lover, but as a vessel. One by one, the obsidian knives came down. Hearts were lifted in the firelight, their surfaces slick and shining. The bodies were rolled down the temple steps, the smear of blood turning the white stone into a crimson cascade. By midnight, the pyramid was a waterfall of red. Torches flickered in the damp air, throwing grotesque shadows of the priests as they moved, draped in the skins of earlier victims, the cloth still wet in places. The crowd did not turn away. Some swayed to the rhythm of the drums, others reached out to touch the blood as it pooled at the base of the steps, smearing it on their faces for blessing. The line between devotion and hunger had vanished completely. When the fires finally burned down to embers, the bodies were gone, some taken for burial, others for purposes the priests did not announce. The plaza was silent except for the last low drum beats, and in that silence, the city seemed to exhale, satisfied yet restless, knowing that the next festival was already marked on the calendar.